I'm Gus Clode, I'm 11 years old and I go to Thomas's Clapham.
I'm Susie Clode and I live in Clapham. I found out 2.5 years ago that Gus had a wheat and gluten intolerance because it was very obvious to us that he wasn't growing, and we'd taken him to the GP who'd monitored him for about a year and recognised that there was absolutely no increase in his height. His weight was steady, but his height didn't increase in any way. And so they referred us to an endocrinologist at St George's Hospital in Tooting, and who did various tests on him. And the first one was a screen for coeliac disease, which was a very simple blood test. And unfortunately that screened positive immediately. And I say unfortunately because clearly it's meant a huge change in his diet and our own. And it's required a lot more thought and time in terms of the food that we have at home and give him. Although actually once that's mastered it becomes quite simple. The real problems we have for Gus are when he's out at parties and at friends' houses and eating out, where virtually everything has a cereal filler or some sort of wheat or gluten. I didn't know anything about coeliac disease, and when the endocrinologist called me with the initial screening results to tell me that he had coeliac disease, I had no idea what she was talking about. And she said he can't eat wheat and gluten, and I had no difference that there was no idea that there was a separation or a difference between the two, because there are people who have a wheat intolerance who are able to process and digest spelt and rye and barley and various other grains. Yeah, but that's not the case with Gus, and it's gluten that's the problem. Gluten is within spelt and barley and rye and wheat, which means that none of those grains are available to him. And he has to live on a diet that consists really of corn flour, corn-based products, corn, maize, soya flour, potato flour, quinoa, and alternative grains that don't contain barley.
I remember like a taste of it, nice, and it's like harder to get nice food, like really nice food without gluten being in it. Bread, cake, and donuts.
When the doctor told me Gus had coeliac disease, I was shocked, and I had really no idea what it meant, and so I did the typical thing, which was go to Google and find out what it meant and the repercussions. And of course, everything one reads on the screen always sounds more horrendous. And I think the fact that it's a lifelong condition was also horrendous, because I think we all live in an age where quick fixes are available normally. And also for such a young child, and for my child, I think I could have accepted it better if it had been for me. But to think that he was so young, I mean, he was 9 at the time, and sort of the Krispy Kreme donut phase had just really hit, and it was everyone's treat, and of course that was no longer going to be available to him, and the Kit Kats after the rugby matches aren't there for him, and there's only certain crisps he can eat, and because of extra fillers and coatings that they use wheat for, he can't eat Smarties anymore, because although they're chocolate, they've got wheat in the candy coating. And it's an infinitesimal amount of tiny, tiny microscopic amount of wheat, of gluten, that has the same impact as if he were to eat a loaf of bread. So he really does have to avoid it at all costs. That's not to say it's life-threatening if he does eat gluten, but it just causes a problem with his digestion. And were that to be continual, the build-up would mean that he wouldn't be able to absorb vital nutrients, minerals that he needs to grow. He was born with it. Coeliac disease isn't something that you develop over time. It's not an allergy as such. It's like diabetes, and it's incurable as we stand, which means it's going to be a lifelong disease for him and struggle. And people with coeliac disease are often go undiagnosed because the degree of the symptoms can vary hugely from patient to patient and person to person. So as far as Gus is concerned, with height, which drew our attention, and luckily, because I've got 2 older children, I realised how slowly he was growing, and against benchmarked as peers as well. But very often it can just be a sort of case of irritable bowel syndrome. It can be a sort of reflux or something, and one doesn't really realise that one can't actually digest gluten. He's lacking a chromosome which allows him to digest gluten, and that's where the problem arises, and there is no medication that can emulate that digestive process. I discover that a lot of foods don't contain gluten, obviously. Things like rice and potatoes and all fruit, all vegetables, all cheeses, all natural and health-giving foods, pretty much. Milk, yogurt, dairy don't contain gluten at source. But of course, the manufactured and processed foods that we buy often have gluten added into them. And I mentioned Smarties, but there can be yogurts that have cereal bits in them, and that those cereal bits will be wheat flakes rather than oat flakes, or there'll be a wheat coating on an oat flake. And so it left me having to digest very carefully every label of everything I buy in the supermarket, right down to the smallest word. And interestingly, I have friends, obviously, who look after Gus now, when Gus goes to tea, who are used to looking out for those things as well, all of whom have started wearing glasses because the print gets so small and they're so used to reading the ingredients list. But it left me with very little, and it's an area that's been, I think the Coeliac Society has been going for about 30 or 40 years, so it's a well-known condition. And over the years, better foods have developed. A lot of companies like Nutricia and a lot of the big European medical companies do make gluten-free foods that are available, some of which are available on prescription in this country, but they tend to be very bland, heavy loaves of bread and uninteresting cakes and biscuits that don't in any way emulate Kit Kats and Mars bars and the things that Gus would most want to eat.
Basically, at first it's like the really odd foods like cakes and breads, which I don't know. But then, say, for the non-obvious, I either not eat it or also what's in it. I think it was a year and a half ago when my mum bought something and she thought it said it was gluten-free, but actually had gluten in. And so we ate it and then we realised it had gluten in.
Sometimes, obviously, these things slip through, and in fact, it was something that was it was sort of freshly prepared by sort of one of these chilled food companies, and they'd made it was cottage pie or something, and clearly they'd used wheat flour as a filler, and hadn't mentioned it as an ingredient. And Gus reacts quite quickly because he's so unused to digesting gluten now that he gets a sort of dyspeptic reaction. So you know pretty soon that he's had it. But of course he's had it, so it's too late, you can't go back, but at least you can trace back, what did you eat today? Well, you had an apple, you had some, rice flakes, it wasn't any of those things, it must have been the cottage pie. The biggest problem though, Gus, is when you go out to eat, isn't it? Because you have to ask in restaurants all the time whether they put cereal in the hamburgers, because he loves hamburgers, and very often they use pure meat. It's very easy at various places, which I could mention or not. Mention GBK, it's fabulous. Dexter's is fabulous because they just use pure meat and flavouring.
McDonald's?
And McDonald's is one that he can have, but not the bread. So that's a big treat if he ever goes out with his mates, because he can have that. He can't obviously have pizza anywhere. Pizza Express have been very good about allowing us to bring in our own pizza bases, which are gluten-free and pre-prepared, and putting the pizza on top. And various other small restaurants will do that, but you have to be prepared, that's it. You can't just say, let's go for pizza, because you need the pizza bases at the ready. Well, I think it's vital that they are tested, because it's the simplest screening process of all, because it literally is a very small blood test, and they can tell very quickly whether you are a sufferer. And that then is confirmed by something slightly more invasive, which is an endoscopy, when they look at your bowel and gut. But again, it's a simple procedure. The consequences of continuing to labour under coeliac disease, particularly undiagnosed, can be very serious, including early onset osteoporosis. It can be life-limiting. There are various skin complaints that can develop as a result of coeliac disease, which really are quite deforming. So it's very, very important, which one mightn't be aware of, not knowing one's a sufferer, until it's too late and these symptoms have developed. So I would encourage people very strongly to go and get themselves tested.